She was dying the way the land dies in drought. Slowly, visibly, with a dignity that made the watching worse. Margaret Slade had been sick for 7 months, and the sickness had taken her the way sickness takes people who live alone on the frontier. Without witnesses, without mercy, without the particular softness that comes from having someone in the next room who will hear you when you fall. She had fallen twice in the last month. Once in the kitchen reaching for a pot on the upper shelf, once on the porch steps coming in from the yard. Both times she had lain on the floor and waited for the strength to return, and both times the strength had taken longer to come back than the time before. She was 58 years old and she looked 70, and she knew exactly what was happening to her because the doctor in Tanner's Ford had told her in plain language 6 months ago, and she had appreciated the plainness because she was not a woman who benefited from gentle phrasing. What Margaret Slade had was time. Not much. Enough. Enough to do one thing that mattered before the rest of it stopped mattering. The ranch was 200 acres of creek-fed bottomland that her husband James had homesteaded 31 years ago, when this part of the territory was nothing but grass and possibility. James had built the house. James had dug the well. James had planted the row of cottonwoods along the creek that were now tall enough to throw shade across the yard in the afternoon. James had died 11 years ago of a heart that stopped one morning without warning, and Margaret had run the ranch alone since then, because the ranch was James, and James was the ranch, and letting go of one meant letting go of both. She had no children. She had a niece in Missouri named Eleanor, who she'd been writing to for 6 years, and who was coming west in the spring with a husband and a baby to take over the ranch because Margaret had asked her to, and because Eleanor was the kind of woman who said yes to things that scared her and then did them anyway. The spring was 4 months away. Margaret needed the ranch to still be there when Eleanor arrived, and the men who had been circling the property for the last 3 months had a different plan. His name was Wade Pollard. He'd arrived in Tanner's Ford with capital and a crew, and the quiet, systematic methodology of a man who understood that the cheapest way to acquire land was to make the current owner desperate enough to sell it for less than it was worth. Pollard had bought 3 ranches along the creek already. Each sale had been voluntary on paper and involuntary in every way that mattered. The Greers had sold after their barn burned. The Millers had sold after their cattle were scattered twice in 1 month, and the fence was cut so many times that Tom Miller had run out of wire. Old Hector Garza, no relation to anyone, 74 and arthritic, had sold after 2 of Pollard's men sat on his porch one evening and explained the situation in terms that didn't require a second explanation. Margaret was next. She knew this because Pollard's men had told her so. 3 visits, each one more direct than the last. The first had been almost cordial. 2 men on horses in the yard offering a price that was half what the land was worth and calling it generous. The second had been Pollard himself, sitting in her kitchen, drinking her coffee, explaining that a woman in her condition shouldn't be worrying about property, and that his offer was really a kindness when you thought about it properly. The third visit had been 5 men. No coffee, no sitting, just a deadline. End of the week. Sign or they'd make the decision for her in ways the law would take months to sort out, and she didn't have months, and everyone in the room knew it. She didn't have months. But she had days. And she had a name. The name had come from Hector Garza, old Hector who had sold and left and was living with his daughter in Brennan now, diminished and quiet and carrying the particular weight of a man who had given up something he shouldn't have. Margaret had written to him, not to blame him, to ask, "Is there anyone?" Hector's reply had been short, a description, a way to send a message, and a warning. He doesn't always come. She'd sent the message from her bed. The neighbor boy, 14, name of Charlie, who came 3 times a week to help with chores she couldn't do anymore, had written to the telegraph office in town and sent it for her. 9 words. Dying woman, 200 acres, 5 men, creekland. The reply came 2 days later. 3 words. Coming. Stay inside. She stayed inside. Not because the message told her to, because her body told her to. The last of the strength was rationing itself now. She could stand for 20 minutes, walk for 10, sit on the porch for an hour if the weather was warm. The sickness had reduced her world to rooms and the distance between them, and she navigated that reduced world with the same stubbornness that had run 200 acres alone for 11 years. He arrived on a Wednesday, late afternoon. Margaret was on the porch in the chair James had built her when her back started going bad. She heard the horse before she saw it. Single rider, easy gait, the stride of an animal that trusted its rider and its rider trusted it, and the trust went both ways and had been tested enough times that testing wasn't necessary anymore. She watched him come up the road and into the yard and stop. The man on the horse looked at her. She looked at him. He was younger than she expected. Or maybe not younger, harder to age, the kind of face that experience marks differently than years. "Margaret Slade?" he said. She nodded. She didn't stand. Standing cost something now, and she spent it carefully. "You got my message," she said. He dismounted, walked to the porch, stood at the bottom of the steps and looked at her the way a doctor looks at a patient, assessing not with judgment but with the practical clarity of someone who needs to know what he's working with. "How long?" he asked. She knew what he meant. He wasn't asking about the deadline. "The doctor said winter," she said. "Could be sooner." He nodded, looked at the ranch. The house, the barn, the cottonwoods along the creek, the fence line running south toward the hills. He was reading it. Not the land, the story on the land. 31 years of work in the fence posts and the roof line and the well-worn path between the house and the barn. A life written in labor and persistence and love. Because you don't maintain something this well for this long without love. And the love was visible in every detail, if you knew how to look. "Tell me," he said. She told him. All of it. Pollard, the 3 ranches, the methodology, the 5 men, the deadline. She told it without self-pity and without drama, because she was a woman who had run a ranch alone for 11 years. And women who do that don't waste words on things that don't change the outcome. She told him about Eleanor, about the niece in Missouri who was coming in the spring with her husband and her baby to take over the ranch, about the letters they'd written back and forth for 6 years, about how Eleanor had said yes without hesitating, and how that yes was the reason Margaret was still sitting on this porch, instead of in a boarding house in town, waiting for the winter she wouldn't see the end of. "I don't need the ranch for me," Margaret said. "I need it for her. 4 months. That's all. If the ranch is standing when Eleanor arrives, everything I did matters. If it's not, then 31 years of James and 11 years of me, and it all just goes into someone's ledger as acreage." The stranger was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that Margaret recognized from James. Not absence, processing. The quiet of a man who takes things in fully before he responds, because responding too quickly means responding to the wrong part. "I'll need your deed," he said, "and everything you know about Pollard's paperwork. The lawyer's name, the bank he uses, and the names of the men who sold." She had all of it. 7 months of being sick had given her nothing but time, and she had used the time the way she used everything. Carefully, completely. She had a notebook. Dates, names, amounts, descriptions of every visit, every threat, every fence that was cut, and every animal that went missing. She'd kept it the way a woman keeps accounts, precise, undeniable. He read the notebook on the porch while the sun went down. She watched him read it and saw in his face the thing she'd hoped to see. Not anger. Recognition. The recognition of a man who had seen this pattern before, and who knew exactly where to press because he'd pressed there before, and the structure had always given way at the same points. "This is thorough," he said. "I had time," she said. "That almost sounded like a joke," he said. She looked at him. It was. He left at dusk, told her to lock the door and not answer it for anyone until morning. She locked the door. She went to bed. She slept better than she had in 3 months because for the first time in 3 months, the weight of everything was not entirely on her. He went to the lawyer first, a man named Beckford who operated out of an office above the general store in Tanner's Ford. Beckford was asleep. The stranger came in through the office window because the office was on the 2nd floor, and the door was locked and climbing was faster than picking. Beckford woke up to candlelight and a man in a poncho sitting at his own desk reading his own files. The files were organized the way crooked files are always organized. Neatly. The careful filing system of a man who knew that what he was doing was wrong, and who had prepared for the possibility of having to explain it by making sure everything looked right on the surface. The stranger wasn't interested in the surface. He went underneath. The deeds, the transfer documents, the correspondence with Pollard, every letter, every instruction, every amount. Beckford watched him read. The lawyer's face went through the stages: surprise, fear, calculation. The calculation of a man who is very quickly determining which side of this he wants to be on when it's over. "You have 2 options," the stranger said without looking up. "You help me, or you join Pollard wherever Pollard ends up, which is where. That depends on Pollard, but it won't be here." Beckford chose the first option. It took him 2 hours to produce everything the stranger needed. Signed affidavits recanting the filings he'd made, copies of the original deeds for the 3 ranches, a letter to the Territorial Land Office explaining the methodology of coercion. His handwriting was steady. His cooperation was complete. Men who build their careers on paper understand paper's power better than anyone. The stranger went to the telegraph office next. The operator was not asleep because the operator was Charlie, Margaret's neighbor boy, who worked nights at the telegraph and days at the ranch, and who was 14 and afraid, and doing both jobs anyway because someone had to. The stranger sent 3 messages. The Federal Land Office, the Territorial Marshal, Judge Brennan. Each message contained specific names and specific claims and specific reference numbers from Beckford's files that would trigger specific responses from offices that moved slowly, unless you gave them reasons to move fast. He gave them reasons. By midnight, the messages were sent. By 2 in the morning, he was on the ridge above Tanner's Ford watching Pollard's operation in the dark. 5 men, 3 at a house on the east side that Pollard had taken from a family named Webb, 2 at the freight office where Pollard kept his money and his records. Pollard himself was at the hotel. The same distribution Clara had described. Men spread thin, coverage over concentration. He visited the 3 ranchers who had sold, one at a time. Moving through the dark the way Scout moved through new country, quiet and attentive, and reading the ground for things that didn't belong. The Greers were awake. They hadn't been sleeping well since they sold. Guilt does that. It sits in the bed next to you and breathes in your ear and reminds you every night that the thing you did during the day was the wrong thing, and that you knew it was the wrong thing while you were doing it. He showed them the affidavits. He told them what was coming. Mrs. Greer put her hand over her mouth and made a sound that her husband hadn't heard in months, and the sound was relief. And the relief was so complete that it came out as something that sounded like grief, because the 2 things live closer together than most people realize. The Millers took longer. Tom Miller was angry, and anger makes men slow because they're processing 2 things at once. He'd been angry since the day he signed, and the anger had hardened into something that looked like acceptance, but wasn't. When the stranger showed him the affidavits and told him the signature could be undone, Tom Miller sat down at his kitchen table and put his hands flat on the wood and stared at them for a full minute. His wife stood behind him with her hand on his shoulder. Neither of them spoke. Then Tom looked up and said, "What do you need from me?" And the stranger told him, and Tom Miller became the second person that night to choose the right side. Old Hector's daughter was harder because Hector was in Brennan and couldn't speak for himself. But his daughter could, and did. She had her father's stubbornness and her father's precision, and when she read the affidavit, she said, "I'll sign for him." And the stranger said, "That's not legal," and she said, "I don't care." And he said, "It doesn't need to be, because Hector's original deed was never properly transferred, and Beckford's own files prove it." She signed anyway, on principle. By 4 in the morning, 3 filed reversals were ready for the land office. By 5, the stranger had visited every business owner on the main street who had been paying Pollard's tax, which was what it was even though Pollard called it a fee, and told them that the fee was over, and the man who charged it would be gone before breakfast. Pollard's men at the freight office were the first to know something had changed. They arrived at 6 for the morning shift and found the building locked from the inside, with a federal hold notice posted on the door that the stranger had written himself, because the federal notice wouldn't arrive for 3 days. But Pollard's men didn't know that, and a piece of paper on a door works just as well as a badge if the people reading it believe what it says. The 2 men stood outside the locked freight office and looked at each other, and made the decision that hired men make when the infrastructure they're paid to protect stops functioning. They went to the livery. They saddled their horses. They left. The 3 at the Webb house discovered the same notice on that door at 7. They also discovered that their horses had been moved from the yard to the livery during the night, and that the livery owner, emboldened by a visit from the stranger at 5:30, had charged them double for the stabling and was not open to negotiation. 2 of the 3 left. The 3rd went to find Pollard. Pollard was in the hotel dining room eating breakfast when the 3rd man arrived with the news. Pollard was still processing the news when the stranger walked in through the front door and sat down across from him uninvited. He placed the documents on the table between Pollard's coffee and Pollard's eggs. The affidavits, the reversals, the federal filing, the letter from Beckford, and Margaret Slade's notebook, every page of it, 7 months of precision that read like an indictment because it was one. Pollard looked at the paper. He looked at the stranger. He was a man who had done this in other towns and who had always left before the consequences arrived. The consequences were sitting across from him now, wearing a poncho and drinking his coffee. "The marshal is riding," the stranger said. "The land office has been notified. Beckford has recanted everything. The Greers, the Millers, and Hector Garza have filed reversals. You have nothing left in this town except a hotel room you're going to vacate in the next 10 minutes. Pollard stared at him. The stare of a man running out of options and knowing it and hating the knowing. "You did all this in one night," Pollard said. The stranger drank the coffee. It wasn't a question, so he didn't answer it. Pollard stood up. He left the breakfast. He left the napkin. He went upstairs and came back with a bag that had been packed the way bags are always packed by men who do what Pollard did. Ready. Light. Designed for exactly this kind of morning. He rode south before 8. His last man rode with him. The town watched them go, from windows and doorways and porches, where people stood with the particular expression of a town that had been held down and had just felt the hand lift. The stranger rode to the ranch at 9. Margaret was on the porch. She'd been on the porch since dawn, listening. She couldn't see the road from the chair anymore because her eyes were going the way the rest of her was going, but she could hear, and what she'd heard that morning was different from every other morning. The town was making noise again. Doors, voices, wagons, the sounds of a place remembering how to function. He walked up the steps and stood in front of her and said, "It's done." She looked up at him. Her eyes were wet and she didn't wipe them because there was no point in hiding what was obvious, and because a woman who was dying had earned the right to cry about the things she was saving. "Eleanor will have it?" Margaret asked. "Eleanor will have it," he said. "All of it. The deed is clean. The filings are reversed. Pollard is gone. The marshal will be here by the end of the week to make it official." Margaret nodded. The nod of a woman setting something down that she'd been carrying for longer than her body could carry it. She reached out and took his hand. Her grip was weak. The bones were close to the surface, but the grip said what it needed to say. "Thank you," she said. 2 words. Sufficient. He stayed for an hour. He fixed a hinge on the barn door that had been loose. He split wood for the stove. He checked the well. Small things that had nothing to do with Pollard and everything to do with a woman alone on a ranch who needed firewood and a working door more than she needed a man who could dismantle land operations in the dark. Charlie came at noon. The boy looked at the stranger and looked at Margaret and understood that something had shifted overnight and that the messages he'd sent at 2 in the morning had been part of it. Margaret told the boy to sit, and she told him everything. The boy listened with wide eyes that got wider as the story went on. When she was done, Charlie said, "I want to help until Eleanor comes." Margaret said, "I know. You already do." The stranger left that afternoon. Margaret watched him from the porch. Scout moved down the road with the easy stride, and the stranger sat the horse the way he always sat, still and balanced, and reading whatever was ahead of him before he arrived at it. She watched until the shape of him dissolved into the road, and the road dissolved into the distance, and the distance was just distance again. She wrote to Eleanor that evening, a long letter, the longest she'd written. She told her about the ranch and the cottonwoods and the creek, and the way the light came through the kitchen window in the morning. She told her about the chair James had built, and the well James had dug, and the path between the house and the barn that 31 years of footsteps had worn smooth. She told her about a man with no name who had ridden in on a Wednesday and done in one night what she couldn't have done in the months she didn't have. She told her the ranch would be there. She told her to come. If this is where you found him, if Tanner's Ford is your first ride, the beginning is waiting. Both stories in the description. Watch them. Come back. Tell me one thing in the comments. Which moment stayed with you? 2 words. That's all. And if you want to know where the trail goes next, subscribe. New stories every week. I'll see you on the road.